Hey, everybody. Welcome to your Nature Journal Educator Forum. I am John Muir Laws. My co-host today is Vea Moore. And we are delighted that you are here with us today. Today, we've got several things planned for you. One is that I have tested a new nature journaling activity that I think rocks. And I wanted to share that with you. So not in the book. Oh, no, you won't find it there. You won't find it anywhere else, except with the participants who I've done this with so far and here. Yes, I also we had a Zoom bombing yesterday during the Ask Jack session. And I thought it would be really useful for us educators to, fortunately, when it happened, I was going like, what? Right. But fortunately, Avea at that moment was cool-headed, and she was like, I found you and you're gone. I found you and you're gone. There's like this cluster that all came in at the same time. And she was just on top of it. And so we thought it would also be good for us to just talk about, as a group, about the protocols. And I see a note in the chat. Avea was awesome. It's so true. It's so true. So let's just talk about how to have a Zoom bomber smackdown. And then we'll get into this activity, and also strategies that other people have for general Zoom hygiene are welcome. Let's just, we're going to review what happened here, and then so we're going to start with this kind of zooming, and we'll review with you what happened to us, how we, or Avea, handled it, and we also want to hear from you what your strategies were. So there we were. I think we were drawing a bird, looking at two little birds, right? And all of a sudden, there was another voice that appeared, and it was spotlighted on me. So this other person didn't, nothing sort of appeared on the screen, but this person started a tirade of profanity and racist comments and just really horrible language. And so now I'm going to bounce over to you, Avea. What did you do at that point? Hey, everybody. So wanted to hear if anybody had any other thoughts, ideas, and suggestions for wrangling the rascals. We just thought it would be really useful for us to share our experience with this, so that you're all ready. It was something that I was not prepared for. Was two things. One was the idea that there would be an organized group of Zoom bombers kind of crashing you at the same time. The other thing that I wasn't expecting was my parasympathetic nervous system response with my, the blood flow to my prefrontal cortex went and I was like, And so just having drilled, I have since kind of drilled, boom, kind of getting to that suspend participant activities button. And so the next time you're on, you might just want to find it for yourself, because I was amazed at Avea's ability to go like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go here, I'm going to do this, get rid of them, boom, 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 report, get rid of them, find the next person, boom, get rid of them, boom, report. That my brain was not functioning at that point. So just sort of be aware that it will kind of initiate a stress response with you, and your ability to think clearly in that situation may not be as clear as you thought it would be.
To validate that for a second, anybody, okay, just for a second, I'm going to mention something a bit. Anybody who's ever been in a traumatic situation might know and might have heard of the whole fight or flight. What they tend not to mention is that there's also freeze. And as a result, if it happens to you, people might be very invalidating and not understand, but it is completely legitimate. We freeze up sometimes when something really upsetting happens to us. And that is every bit as legitimate as fight or flight. So if it happens to you, please don't blame yourself. It takes a lot to train yourself to overcome the freeze response. And I've had to train myself. I freeze too. In fact, Jack might have thought I was moving fast, but I was freezing up in my own brain. I'm just glad that for some reason that translated to enough speed in real time. But I thought that Jack didn't freeze because Jack had put down, was just locked the meeting down. And I was like, Jack handled it. So us working together, so yeah, just remember and be kind to yourself that freezing, don't be hard on yourself for that, please.
I think I just said parasympathetic response. That's the sympathetic nervous system that is doing the flight or flight thing. The parasympathetic is the everything is happy, let's digest our dinner sort of a thing. Hey, would you guys like to see a cool nature journaling activity? All right, thumbs up on that. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, I was invited to go down and do a teacher training at the Anza Borrego Desert State Park, and went down there and met with a bunch of teachers. And I was getting ready to do an activity, but as I was out there with my first group, the idea of this activity occurred to me, and it had never been tested. So I decided they're on my tests, and we did it, and they loved it, and it went really well. So here's the way it looked. What we did is I had a little dry erase board. Where is my little dry erase board? I'll get it for you. So in my little sketching kit, this little tiny dry erase board, it fits in there. And if you have a dry erase board, it helps to carry a dry erase pen with you. And what I did is I wrote structure and function. I'm doing that now. I wrote that on the board, and I held it up and I asked them to sort of describe this to me, and an example of that. And so people gave several examples of it. So what we did is we started just by, this is what in next generation science standards, they refer to as a cross-cutting concept. It's a big picture idea that you're going to bump into again and again and again and again and again, and all sorts of different things that you can be looking at. So we started off just by seeding the idea of structure and function with everybody, and to make sure that we all kind of had the same definition on our hands. Then what I invited them to do is to go out into the desert there, and it was hot, and it was going to get hotter. So I think it was maybe 95 degrees, and it was going to get hotter. And so I first talked to everybody about the importance of what you're going to do is you're going to go find an interesting plant that you can observe from the shade. Again, if your participants, if the students you're working with, if they get hot and overheated, they're not going to be able to think. Same with teachers. So this was something you can observe from the shade. And then what you wanted to do is in the center of your page, and I wiped this down on the knee of my pants, and I've got a clear board here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to describe the observations I make about the structure of the plant that I'm observing. So there's a little choya there. And so we talked about how you can use, they were kind of new to this. So we talked about kind of words, pictures, and numbers, and how I can be, writing things in. I could be doing kind of labels. I can be counting things and putting those sorts of notes in. So we talked a little bit, for them they were new to nature journals. We talked a little bit about words, pictures, and numbers, these sort of things. So I'm getting this cluster of sort of structural observations here in the center of my page. All right. And then we also, one of the people sort of mentioned sort of doing an enlargement of something. And so we talked about, that and how you can, I'm going to even draw a little arrow down here. It's going to come out of that box. There's a little enlargement. So by the way, when I was talking about that, I drew a little box like this with an arrow coming down to it. And guess what? I saw a lot of those in their work when I was looking at them later on. So demonstrating things on a little whiteboard like this, crazy powerful. Because all of a sudden you're asking people to do this visual thing. There's this little kind of visual thing of the visual thing that you're going to be doing. It helps everybody just get a much clearer idea of like, oh, I understand what we're doing. All right, so, but there's nothing really new so far. You're saying like, okay, you make some observations, you're gonna put them down in your journal, you're making an enlargement. Okay, right. So here's the part B to this that made it interesting. So I then want you to look at this object from the framing of thinking about structure and function. And what I'd like you to do is to look at it and to come up with a, see if you can come up with a possible, plausible explanation for one of the structures that you see on this thing. You don't have to be right. You don't have to be right. And what you're going to do is you're going to put this down on your page using tentative language. So what scientists call the language of uncertainty, where instead of saying like, this is this to do this, because I don't really know. I think it might be. So I can write in perhaps blah, 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 blah. Right? So there I wrote perhaps blah, 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 blah. And I'm going to put a little box around that. And I'm going to show that that kind of perhaps statement kind of connects right up there. And then I'm going to think, oh, well, maybe perhaps this little thing here, or another way I could say this is, could it be? Right? So perhaps could it be? Right? So I'm intentionally starting this little box with a word that says, I'm not sure, but maybe this. So there is a little box doing that. And as I'm looking across this thing, I want to do that for as many of these sort of structures that I can. I want to kind of get, and also one person said like, and this might be kind of a fun extension of it. Somebody said like, what if you can think of more than one explanation for what it could be? I thought, oh, that's good. So what I can do is then kind of box off this, right? Or perhaps blah, 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 blah. Right? That's kind of fun. And then we're going to come back here and we're going to share these. So send everybody out to do this. But before I did, I just sort of noticed again, like today is really hot. And when things are really hot, our brains don't work as well. We tend to get like that. So what I said to everybody is, and this is something that I will often say, but it ended up being particularly important and particularly helpful in this context with a new twist. What I said is that what's going to happen when you're out there at some point, you are going to be looking at this plant in front of you, and you're going to get this feeling like, all right, all the things that I could observe about this, I've observed those, I've got them, I've recorded them on my piece of paper, and I'm done. I'm done. You're going to get this very clear, confident, satisfying feeling of being done. But being done is a phenomenon that makes sense for cooking a turkey, but it doesn't actually apply to observing, because there's an infinite amount of things that you could observe. So, but everybody's going to get this feeling of being done. And what that is it's just being done is the point at which you usually just stop paying attention. So your brain is going to say to you, done. And when that happens, it said, you see right over there, that's a cooler. And it is filled with cold drinks. I want everybody to bring a cold drink with them. And when you get to that feeling of being done, I want you to stop, crack open your can, crack open your cold drink, visual aid, yeah, and give yourself some nice cold, refreshing beverage. And then what I want you to do is to look back at it and see if you can, if there's other observations or other possible structure function connections that you can make. And we're going to put those down on your page as well. And we'll see what is the most interesting observation or structure function idea that you come up with once you get once you get to that point of I'm done. So I've told people to kind of notice for that I'm done before and to keep going. This time I added at that point, you're going to get your little refreshing beverage, or another version of this could be if you send them out with little snacks, at that point, you open up your little snack bag, right? And have yourself a little bit of a snack. And then you go back to it and see what else you can do. So then people came back, and then we talked about structure and function. We talked about like what observations did anybody come up with see a structure that you came up with sort of a possible sort of structural connection for. And we then had a very interesting discussion about structure and function, using people's nature journals as the bouncing off place for that. Then a number of people who felt comfortable doing it, people shared their journals around, and it was a ton of fun. The activity worked really well. So what was new about this is there's a cluster of observations in the center, and then we're intentionally finding these sort of structural, possible, plausible things. We're putting those in. I'll show you my page from the day. Right, so the things that are in those sort of yellow boxes are could it be's, possible, plausible, perhaps this, perhaps that, right? And that was the activity. So a little bit of structure, a little bit of scaffolding enabled us to have a very interesting discussion around structure and function. Because these were teachers, we then kind of put on our metacognitive hats, and we talked about kind of why we're doing this in this way. We talked about intentionally using the cross-cutting concept as this sort of principle to hang things around. We then talked a little bit about if I had used a different cross-cutting concept, if I had held up on my piece of paper the word change, right? Stability and change, and used a different cross-cutting concept. And you were then thinking about that. How would that have changed the way you thought about and you wondered about this plant in front of you? It was a really interesting discussion with those teachers. And I think we've got another activity in our Nature Journal Educator quiver. Just got to come up with a name for this one. So I would love to hear from you folks, your thoughts or ideas about that activity, how you might extend it or what you might do. I'm going to first bounce over to our friend, Billy Joe. Billy Joe, great to see you.
Hey, so it's interesting that you came up with, or like you brought this one up today, because I think I had a similar experience in the last couple of days, with students. So I had two high school groups, and we walked out of the back of the school, same school, but two different classes. And so we went down, and there's the place called Fletcher's Creek, which just runs like through the middle of the city, but there's a forested area. And one of the classes was a geography class. And so the only thing that's different, I think, is that I didn't specifically say structure and function, but I wanted them to look at the land and then to assess what's going on with the land. And so they were able to look at, the hill, the trail, and then the river, and what was kind of going on in that entire situation. And so, some of them would say, well, I noticed it's wide, the creek is wider in this section, but it's more narrow in this section. I mean, great. Why do you think that's happening? Well, I said, what are you noticing that's giving you the evidence that would make that make sense? And they said, oh, well, I noticed there's a big tree on that side of the river, and there's rocks on this side of the river. Great. So those are actually in the same spot of where it's narrowing. Why do you think that that might be? You know, well, maybe there's less erosion there. Great. Why was there less erosion there? And then we were able to say, like, form and function, the plant roots, the tree roots, as well as the rocks are going to create a space that is not going to allow as much erosion as it would be above where there is none of that, where you could see it's also on a bend. So we were really looking at the form and the function of it without actually saying form and function. So I really think that this can be tied to like overall physical structures of the land in itself, right? And really kind of nerding out and going a little deep into like, how was this land sort of, how did it get to look like this, right? Like, so if it's Mississauga, is this man-made? Was this space glacier? What is the rock bed? So being able to have all those different conversations about the fact that it's sedimentary rock, it was under ocean, how does it sort of play into it? And one girl was looking at a tree, and so I said to her, so what are you journaling? And she said, well, I'm journaling this tree. And I said, okay, cool. I said, what are you thinking about this, and how does this relate to the physiology of the land? And she says, well, I'm noticing that it looks like it's dying, and maybe it has disease. I'm like, interesting. So I said, I noticed that it's on the bottom of the hill. I said, what could be playing into the death of this tree based on evidence that you're seeing? And so then we were able to have, again, a great discussion around the
Mhm.
structure of the land and what is happening and how that might sort of be impacting those trees. So interesting, like that might be an extra place for this to maybe sort of go in sort of that form and function. And then really quickly, as another student was looking, I'm pretty sure it's called black tar spot up here. It's on the leaves. And it's a disease. And I just, we went through, it was the first time doing it. So we went through like, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. And so this student, without prompts, had already zoomed in on where it had sort of eaten away at the leaf. And I was like, yeah, this is amazing, blah, blah, blah. And so I said to her, like, it's great that you've asked these questions. I said, but now, like, next level, I said, is I want you to come up with ideas of what you think's going on. And she looked at me and was like, you really want to know what I think? I said, yeah, that's the whole point, right? And I
Ah,
was like, yes. And she's like, well, I have a theory. And I was like, give it to me, right? Give me your theory. So she had come up with the fact that based on the evidence that she was seeing, she thought this disease had originated in the soil, moved up the trees. Based on her evidence of how thick the branches were, it depended on how that disease was making its way through the tissue. She then got out to the leaf and was looking at the tar spot. She was like picking at it and dissecting it with her pencil and coming up with concepts about how the structure of the leaf and the tissue might be able to allow that disease to come into certain spaces and not others. And I was like, yes, like this is
this is
it,
beautiful.
right? Yeah, so just maybe like just a couple ideas to throw that I thought sort of really connected with what you just kind of showed us is really looking at like a couple of different things, like how did disease get there, how is it taking over, and what are the structures and the functions of that, not only the disease but what it's taking over. And then again, like looking at a piece of land, and the cool thing about this piece of land is that they can go back multiple times to be able to see how that changes when you add rain, when you add snow, when you add all this other kind of stuff. And I thought that sort of played in nicely to what you just introduced in terms of form and function as well. So
Yeah.
that's all I wanted to
Oh,
add.
Billy Joe, that sounds like it was a fantastic activity.
It was so amazing. Yeah. If
That's
anyone wants to
beautiful.
like geek out on hers, I asked her if I could take a picture and I posted it on my Instagram because it was so awesome. And then she told me later that she wants to be a forensic scientist. And I was like, well, I think you just forensic scientist the crap out of that leaf because that was awesome. Right. So really, really
Yeah.
cool.
And so again, I see this in all these situations, you're using this idea of sort of now create an explanation and then look for the evidence for that as these sort of critical pivot points to help people kind of get the next level and the next level. That is really useful.
Like I think that's something that I think you've always said is like, that's a great idea. What's your evidence? And so my whole thing was like, observe the evidence and then give it to me. Like and that's such a big concept for a lot of students, is they're like, you just want the right answer. And I'm like, I don't want the right answer. I just want to know what you're thinking based on your evidence, right? Like, what do you see around you that is going to support your thought process, right? And I just thought, like, so cool.
So what you just said is so critically important. Could I get you to say that again? What you're saying about that you're not worried about them being right. What is your goal?
So I'm not looking for a right answer. I am looking for their thought process and what evidence are they observing that can support their thoughts. I just want to know their thoughts.
Yes.
And that is huge. And all of them look at me like I have 13 eyes because they are looking for the rubric. They are looking for the check in the box. Billy Joe's looking for this kind of answer. And this girl who was looking at the leaf, I could see her in her mind. And I just looked at her finally and I said, take everything that basically you've been taught and we're going to throw it out the window today. And she's like, everything, literally everything. And I was like, yeah, I just want you to use your brain today. Like, that's all I'm asking you to do. And it was almost extremely liberating. And then I watched her suck her friend into it, who was super quiet and shy, and they were debating over the evidence. And I was like, yes, this is amazing. And it was so cool, right? So
and my work is done.
Like, yeah, exactly, right? Like a mic drop, I'm out, right?
See, and here in the States, in our next generation science standards, that is the experience that we're trying to get kids to.
And that's where I'm trying to get them to get out of the box here and think that, like, you can still cover the in the box stuff, but give them a place to think, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally get it.
I love that. I absolutely love that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for letting me share, because I just think it really meshed
really
absolutely nicely with what you were talking about. Yeah. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Billy Joe, that absolutely rocked my world. Thank you. Let's bounce over to Laura Markham and then Ivea. And Spotlight there. Laura, good to see you. You're currently muted.
Sorry about the mask, but I have students in the room. So
no
I just wanted, we're doing a lot with structure and function in class. My students have been going out to our pollinator garden, but we are also growing beans, bush beans, and we have been observing them. And so, I think it was about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks ago, they started to get new buds, and it's like, ooh, we've got something new. Let's kind of look at it, describe it, and try to figure out what it was. And the cool thing is we come back in 2 days and it looks a little bit more, and it's like, oh, it's a flower, and taking apart the flower and today was the first day that they saw that the bean starting to come out of the, the ovary and becoming the bean. And, but one of my students actually had noticed the other thing that we've been doing is just looking for patterns and then asking the community of the rest of the classroom, do you see that this is a pattern I'm seeing? Do you see this pattern? And then we do the, well, what do you think? What do you think is the cause? What do you think, what do you think might making this happen? And so today, somebody noticed that the leaves on the bottom of the bean plant were starting to turn yellow. And so we asked the rest of the class, is everybody else, what do you see? And so some of them are like, well, mine aren't quite turning yellow, but they're getting dry. And somebody else, was, this is this. So, and one of them was like, ours has fallen off. They're not even on there anymore. The first leaf. And so then we just was brainstorming what do you think might be causing it? And I wasn't expecting them to jump all the way, but that was me underestimating. Was the first suggestion was, well, I think that the leaves above it are shading it and it's not getting enough light. And so it's that. And I was like, oh, okay. How does that connect this whole structure function? If it can't get light, then what else can't it do? And we kind of went from there actually to a more in-depth discussion about photosynthesis, but it was all about using those prompts, the cross-cutting concept prompts of structure and function. When you ask what could it be, it's really, what do you think is the cause of this effect? And then the coming back to the structure and function. And we have journaled the stuff out of our bean plants. And so we have looked at the roots, we've looked at the stems, we've looked at the leaves, we've got flowers, we're going to get fruit, which is awesome. And it's still going to be a surprise when we get more than one bean out of the bean plant, because they just don't have a lot of experience with growing things. But even though we started with the pods, it was interesting. That's interesting. But yeah, we've been using a lot of that and pulling things from different activities that you have in the book. So
well, that's great. So I'm hearing this sort of 4-part pattern in what you're saying. You're starting with observations. You then are saying, is there a pattern here? Somebody identifies a pattern. You have other people get in on this and see if you can verify the pattern. How strong is this pattern? Mm-hmm. What are the variations on it? And then you're coming up with possible explanations for that. And I really like the way you're talking about those as possible explanations, just as Billy Joe was doing. You're not saying you need to have the answer now. Because also on some of these, some of the structures that things have, it is not, some of as we look out in the world, some of the features that we see are adaptations to do specific things, and mm-hmm. some of them aren't. So you can see features on things that are not an adaptation to do something specific. Sometimes, for instance, a characteristic on something that we're looking at, what was selected for, that gene actually codes for multiple things. And so you might be looking at a characteristic that wasn't selected for, but still is very prominent on what you're looking. So that's why I like how you're also continuing to use, as Billy Joe was, this tentative language that allows for us to think of these possibilities, but not get into a trap by our own language.
Mm-hmm. And we do come back and it's what are your observations? What's your evidence? How does this support it? And to come back to it. And being an actual science class, we do eventually connect up. I think one of the differences is because starting with the patterns, they brought in all sorts of different kinds of flowers, and we kind of looked at what are some of, things that they have in common, or what are things that the leaves have in common? And so we ended up with the characteristics that might be for that. When we're doing it that way, it's more of a trying to find what are the common things about a leaf, so that we can find out what is a leaf's job, or the common things about roots. What is a root's job? So we can have evidence for that kind of thing. But yeah, so
I like it.
but we are also, you're dealing with out in the pollinator garden, we have native plants, but looking at beans, it's grown, right? It's something that it's human selected, so who knows, right, whether it's got a structure and a function that's we understand. So
yeah, and it's the so we and also we just sort of as scientists, we want to kind of, there's something which people call evolutionary storytelling, which is when you say, this evolved to do this, but there's all sorts of jumps in our thinking there that may not be accurate. And so again, that tentative language, very, very, very powerful. Thank you so much for that, Laura. I'd like to bring on Ivea, add you into the spotlight here.
Hey there. So this is pretty much just to kind of follow up on things that I already heard. I apologize if I'm repeating anything. I was doing some things.
No. This is we like repetition.
Okay, thanks. That's good. Okay, so first of all, when I was listening to both of you, and then when I was listening to Billy Joe talk about what's your evidence for why this is, I really liked the connection there to visual thinking strategies. So I wanted to mention that could be something fun to tie into as well, about what's the evidence that you see that makes you think that. And then to remember that if people are trying to use the evidence as why something is, then you kind of go the other way around and you get the idea. The other thing is that I noticed that you talked about how you were having a discussion about the structure of the land. And what that made me think of is that it also might be a good activity to do in pairs or groups, because sometimes the discussion piece can help you when you get stuck on something. So I noticed that particularly, that the discussion seemed to produce such a rich outcome. So just something else to mention is possibly doing it in pairs. Another thing is that what you were talking about with like looking at possible explanations for the structure. Jack, when you were saying that, it made me think of Y-webs. So I'm not sure if that's already tied in or not, but just wanted to mention that with the Y-webs, because then that way, if people get too stuck on one thing, then you can tell them to expand their thinking by, hey, what about if you tried as many different possible explanations as possible? So as ways to kind of play with it, so that either you can deep dive into one, which might produce more questions, or you can say, okay, we need to step back and broaden our thinking a little bit more. So let's do a Y-web, just as a thought. Another thing is that I love the whole scientific language of uncertainty. It could be one of those things that where it could be fun to have a discussion about that at first, that people understand it. But then it could even lead into, if you're trying to tie into language, it could even lead into an activity where you try to make a list of examples of language of uncertainty, because we have maybe, we have could be, we have might be, perhaps, possible. And then that could lead into the whole talk about subjunctive. I don't know if anybody else has ever heard this. When in doubt, use subjunctive. Okay, that's a bad joke. Anyways, and that's mostly what I wanted to say, but also that because you were talking about structure versus function, it'd be fun to kind of go down the entire list of the science standards and find different nature journal activities to tie in with each of those, and to find ways of making each of those like specifically within nature journaling. And that's all I was going to say, feedback on what I was hearing from all of you. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you, Vet. Billy Joe, did you want to tag into any of that?
Yeah, so it happens just on its own, but I just wrote in the chat that some of those kids were in groups already, like just the way that they kind of sit. I say find your own space, but I don't try to limit them to make them sit by themselves, because some people really do need to chat with other people around them in order to sort of get those juices flowing. So I kind of just let them be in their small groups, or if it's somebody who's individual, they really want to be individual. But then with this particular class yesterday, I actually had them all come back together. And I was like, okay, let's do a big share because it's a geography class and we were really looking at the land, and there's so many possibilities with what's going on. And then because I had spoken with so many of them and went down some of these rabbit holes, I was able to remember who I had the conversations with and be like, share with everybody like what you thought. And then going down that, and we had this massive discussion for probably half an hour, 40 minutes of like a full group discussion on like what were the possibilities that were going on with the land. And we never answered anything with certainty. We only answered it based on our observations, what we thought, what we knew about the land. And that's what I said to them, like, there's nothing. And then this is the best part. So a kid is walking with me. He goes, you've got a background in geography, right? Like, this is what you studied in school. And I went, no, not at all. And he was like, what? And I go, no, I have no idea. I don't really know anything like more than what you guys do. I said, we're only basing this off our observations. He was like, wow, that's really cool. I go, yeah, you don't need to be an expert in anything. Like, isn't that amazing? Like, this
That's
guy totally
huge.
thought I had done like 4 years master's degree or something like that in geography. I was like, I've taken some courses, but I said, I'm not a geography expert. I said, but you don't need to be if you're just looking at the evidence and you're looking at what's in front of you, which I thought was so cool. So I watched my car and I was like, yeah, today was a good day.
Yeah, power of observation, more important than being an expert in anything.
Yeah.
Pay attention.
Yeah, because I said to them, like, you can research all that stuff later. But I said, like, if you don't have the process of knowing to ask the questions and then to come up with ideas, how can you possibly know where to start when you're ready to go to research, right? And so with high school kids, and I talked about this a little bit last week, we talked about it, but some of the kids are trying to understand, especially at high school level. Little kids are just like, we love it. But high school kids are like, where is the skills? Like, where is the transferable skills? And so, like a kid said to me, I said, like, what do you want to be when you become an adult? And he was like, I want to be an architect. And I was like, cool. So you're going to be nature journaling for the rest of your life. And he just looked at me and he was like, what are you talking about? I go, everything. I said, this whole process of noticing what the other buildings are looking like, looking at the structures, blah, blah, blah. I said, you're going to be wondering, how do I make it not fall over? But now someone's giving me a budget to work in. So now you have to know information about other materials. What materials are going to be able to flex? This is where you're building it, downtown Toronto. This is the weather. This is the wind speeds. He was like, oh. And I said, yeah. I said, this is a process of learning to think and to have your thoughts and then put them on paper. I said, this will be transferable no matter what it is you're doing. And I said, this today, the squirrel nest is your medium. And I said, you're going to feel better for being outside. And I said, here's all this other stuff that's going to like be awesome with this. Right. And so those are some of the conversations I've been having with high school students lately, which is interesting. Yeah.
You just tell them, if anything else, aim for having a PhD and asking questions.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's what I say to them. I just want you to learn to ask great questions, right? Like, it's all about questions and then asking more questions based on your questions. I always just ask them a question back. They ask me a question and then I just ask a question back. So I'm like, I'm not going to give you an answer because that's not what we're doing here. We are asking questions, right? And so I just love that back and forth. And, a kid said to me one day, he's like, it's like a mind map. And I was like, yes, it is. I said, so get mind mapping, right? So yeah, so it's that brainstorming of ideas, of possibilities, right? Around some of these really cool questions. And it's amazing when you give them the space to do that. It's just like it pours out of them, right? And that to me is where the magic is really happening, and that is why I love this whole process so much.
I love your energy so much.
Yeah, I want to be one of your students. I really do, Billy Joe. This is great. Something that this is making me. There's a bunch of research sort of looking at that. It is in these discussions that people really kind of come up against the boundaries between what they thought before, and it's in these discussions that we make new meaning. But creating the environment that allows these discussions to really flourish can be challenging, You can't just sort of say, discuss, and everybody opens up, because if you don't have a classroom culture that makes that safe, you in order to have those discussions that you're having, you've had to do a lot of scaffolding. I think that that having discussions in nature journaling should be a full topic for one of our Nature Journal Educator forums. I'm going to bring Aisha in on this, who looks like, oh, there you go.
Hey, that very last thing you said, just tying into what you all have been talking about, is like, I wonder if almost the title you would write on your whiteboard, we should think about sometimes, is actually not writing structure and function or form and function, but actually writing uncertainty. And have that be, because that seems like that's the bottom line you're trying to get out of it, right? Really, in terms of scientific thinking. Like the other all pieces are all very nice and fine, but those are more back in the box thinking. You're trying to push your students to be, uncertainty. Today, that's our topic. Yeah. What's our language of uncertainty? And just unpack that with the group. So they're like, oh, this is where we're going today.
So Aisha, you'll be glad to know that in addition to putting a little note here, have a nature journaling educators forum specifically about leading discussions, I've also put one on here about uncertainty. Because that it just sort of cracks open the whole idea of epistemology. How do we know what we know? And what's your level of certainty on that? How did you get to that level of uncertainty? And we all have this subjective experience that all the things that I think were arrived at through some sort of form of deliberation and a process of making decisions. But a whole bunch of the things that I think did not come through that way. They just sort of came through, oh, because I identify with this social group. That's what I'm going to think. Or similar factors. Being, how do you deal with that uncertainty? It is scary for some teachers to deal with uncertainty because they think, if I'm a science teacher, I'm supposed to be teaching in the realm of facts, giving you a bunch of information. Here's this nugget of information. Here's the nuggets. We've lined them all up. Now memorize those because that's going to be on the test on Thursday. As opposed to the process of how do we get information in there? How do we evaluate it? These days, there's no problem with getting information. It's how do you sort through what's useful and what's not? What's wrong? What's biased? What's the, it kind of goes back to that the big saying that I try to get my daughters to say all the time of, that's interesting, Daddy. What's the evidence for that?
Yeah, I found, oh, sorry, Ivea has her hand up.
Yeah.
Oh, just really fast then. I wanted to say, one thing I noticed that you'd said in the chat, Aisha, was also a lot of it seems to naturally occur when you encourage the I wonder and remind them of the who, what, and why, which I appreciated you saying that, because the I wonder really is like, let's have some questions and here part of the triad there. The other thing I wanted to quickly say is if we do a thing on language of uncertainty, can I do like a 2-minute mini lesson on subjunctive, just because it might be kind of fun?
Please.
Also, I noticed that Kate is raising her hand, but I'm going to let Aisha and Kate and whoever else wants to talk now. Thank you.
So I'm going to just make a quick note here of the subjunctive.
Hey, so
Where we do that, right.
I'm in Hawaii, right? And I work with a lot of Native Hawaiian, indigenous people, and within the culture, I've been dancing hula for a number of years. But I recognize that most of my education comes from a Western background. And so it's been this really interesting interplay. And one of the struggles that we tend to have with a lot of Native, or not struggles, but like a difference of opinion, is there's this very strong sense of you listen to the teacher's always right. You follow, like there's much more of this deference to authority that's even more so than in other places, because it's so much a part of the culture. But as we were talking, I realized the difference when you are nature journaling, or in Hawaii, like the practice is called kilo, is to like observe, is that you make nature, or the aina, which is what we call it here, be the teacher. so that you are the teacher, not the person isn't the teacher. In that moment, the land is, the object is in front of you. And so that's where your knowledge is coming from. And I just like, I'm just so grateful for this, because I suddenly like that made that switch in my head, because it's been really challenging of trying to find really respectful ways to engage with these very different learners from different cultures and backgrounds, and, you know, that different sense of hierarchy. And so, but I feel like, so that's something that I'm going to bring to my Hawaiian Educators Forum that I'm going to this afternoon, and bring up this kind of idea is like, when can we have the land be the teacher? And that, you know, and that's what you guys are talking about with evidence and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Kate,
I wanted to, comment, thank you, because Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about that in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And I loved that when she said that she realized she was not the one who everything had to be on as a teacher in the field. She was like, oh, right, the land is the teacher with me. And I used that so many times in my classes, especially if I was having a really off day. It was a reminder of humility also, that what's out here will be the teacher, and I will guide as I can, but I may not have to guide that much. But yeah, thank you for reminding us of that.
So we have we've got tons of stuff here that we can tease out and explore more, which we will do in a subsequent Nature Journal Educators Forum, because I know a bunch of folks have to get on to their next class. We've gone over 25 minutes. We try to keep these ones shorter, but there was just so much good stuff pouring in, we couldn't stop. But we will return to this idea of, were we to return to the idea of uncertainty and use of the subjunctive, of looking at the evidence that nature provides, and kind of going back to that, connecting the statements we make, the claims we make, with evidence that we can observe. Again, that wonderful VTS prompt. What do you see that makes you say that? Right? So powerful. And we should also discuss discussion. I want to thank everybody so much for your participation in this workshop, in this discussion, and for the work that you do to share these skills with an ever-growing community of educators. I also want to send a special shout out again to Evea Moore, the mad botanist, for not just helping manage this one, this meeting when things go well, but I know you've got my back when things go wrong. So I'm going to just drop you in here as spotlight again. Thank you, everybody, and we really look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you. And thank you, Jack. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, my friends.